Buddhism has a goddess called the Mother of 70 million Buddhas. 18 arms, 3 eyes, her own scripture, and a mantra still recited today. And depending on which Buddhist tradition you ask, she may not even be the same goddess. Some will tell you she's Guanyin. Her scripture tells a practitioner to sit down in front of a mirror, bless a handful of flowers, scatter them across the glass, recite 1,080 times. Then look, something is supposed to appear in there. Her name is Cundī, and she wasn't forgotten. That's the strange part. People kept remembering her, and kept remembering her differently. If you've watched this channel for a while, you know how these stories usually open. Tara made a vow and refused the body she was told to want. Milarepa killed people before he sang a note. Cundī's Chinese story opens with ritual instructions. A birth, a vow, a name before the name. None of that comes with her. She has an Indian existence, texts, images, and traditions connecting her with the early Pala rulers of Bengal. But what resurfaces, over and over, for more than 1,000 years, is the practice. People lose it and rebuild it and carry it somewhere else. And that third answer, the one where she turns out to be Guanyin, took most of 1,000 years to become sayable. In the late 560s or early 570s, an Indian monk working in China named Jinnagupta puts together an anthology of Dharani. One quick definition, because that word runs through everything ahead. A Dharani is a sacred formula, recited for protection and for ritual effect. English usually calls it a mantra. The two categories overlap without quite matching. Inside Jinnagupta's collection sits a spell with a startling name. The holy spell of the 70 million Buddhas. Then it turns up again. A very short text attributed to Xuanzang carries the same formula with the transliteration slightly altered. Then, in 685 or 686, something changes. A translator called Divakara gives her an entire scripture of her own. The Buddha, seated at Jetavana, looks ahead at the beings of a future age, feels sympathy for them, and speaks. Homage the formula opens to the 7 koti of perfectly awakened ones, then the 6 syllables that carry the practice. Om Chale Chule Chunde Svaha. 3 of those words are her, Chale, Chule, Chunde, vocative forms of Chala, Chula, and Chunda, 3 variations of the same name, called out one after the other. Even her mantra can't settle on what to call her. And stay with that number for a second, because koti is easy to underestimate. A koti is 10 million. It's the same word sitting behind the Indian crore, still in daily use across South Asia today. 7 koti means 70 million. The Chinese scripture calls her the Buddha Mother of 70 million Buddhas, a title she arrives already carrying before we learn a single thing about her. And Divakara isn't the end of it. Within decades, Vajrabodhi produces a version, then Amoghavajra. Copies of her material end up out west at Dunhuang, where the desert kept the paper alive. By the time those two finish, the scripture no longer travels alone. It arrives with a full ritual manual attached. So before we ask why she kept resurfacing, we need to see what practitioners were being told to do. Start with the 18 arms. She's usually seated on a lotus, pale with 3 eyes. Her forms vary enormously, from 2 arms upward, and the 18-armed version is the one that stuck in East Asia. A sword, a vajra, a noose, a vase, a wheel, an axe. These are the familiar tools of tantric Buddhist power, and Cundī gathers a remarkable number of them into one body. Now the right, as Divakara's text sets it out. The practitioner finds clean ground near a Buddha image, smears it with cow dung, and marks out a square mandala, large or small, decorated as far as their means allow. They recite over perfumed water and sprinkle it in every direction to seal the boundary. A vessel of that water goes at the center, and one at each of the 4 corners. Then they kneel inside the mandala, facing east on the right knee, and recite 1,080 times. At which point the text says, the water vessels begin to turn by themselves. And yes, the text really says this. Then the flowers. 1,080 more recitations over them, then scattered onto the face of a mirror. The practitioner looks straight into the glass and recites 1,080 times again. And the scripture states it plainly. Then you should see images of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas in the mirror. Then questions may be asked and answered. The numbers elsewhere are enormous. 800,000 recitations to clear sins accumulated across countless kalpas, including the 5 rebellious sins. At 100,000, the tradition says, the practitioner dreams of Buddhas and sees themselves vomiting black things. 200,000 for graver sins. At 700,000, the black turns white, like creamy rice, which the text reads as the sign that the debt has cleared. So why would anybody do all this? Because the scripture promises a great deal more than a vision in a mirror. Recite the Dharani, it says, and karmic offenses accumulated over eons can be purified. In every place you are born, you meet Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. You always have what you need. You become capable of keeping the pure Bodhisattva precepts completely. You are born human or higher, you never fall into the evil destinies, and the heavenly guardians keep watch over you. For lay households, the promises get closer to the ground. Homes protected from calamity and disease. Affairs that go smoothly. In the world of this scripture, reciting the Dharani is what you did when something needed to change. Your karma, your circumstances, your safety, and eventually the shape of your next life. Repetition sits at the center of it. Hundreds of thousands of recitations, working on whatever obstructs the practitioner, with the visions and the dream signs giving those invisible changes a visible form. Centuries later, the requests get more recognizable. Children, health, a court case, whatever problem happened to be sitting in front of the person reciting. Cundi was somebody people turned to for help. The scripture names monks, nuns, laymen, and laywomen, and reaches even to beings it describes as having meager merit and no roots of goodness. Then it asks for ground, dung, water, vessels, offerings, purification, and recitation counts in the hundreds of thousands. And that extraordinary title never gets explained. Buddha mother of 70 million Buddhas, with no story anywhere in which she gives birth to 70 million of anything. The text is exact about what to do and silent about who she is. Nothing here says where she came from, or what she wants, or why 70 million Buddhas came out of her. The instructions survive, her story doesn't. 400 years later, a monk called Daoshin looked at that procedure and made the mirror carry almost all of it. He's writing under the Liao, a Khitan-ruled empire governing a large multi-ethnic population in the north. His book has a title that gives away the project, the Xianmi Yuan Tong Chengfo Xinyao Ji, Essentials for Attaining Buddhahood Through the Perfect Interpenetration of the Exoteric and the Esoteric. One system, joining open Buddhism to esoteric Buddhism. And at the center of it, he puts Cundī. Somebody asks him why. If concentrating on one spell works, why this particular one? He gives 3 reasons and they're still on the page. First, Cundī contains all the other mantras. His image is the ocean and the rivers. The ocean takes in 100 rivers, and no river takes in the ocean. Second, the altar for Cundī is easy for people to manage. One new mirror, never used before, and that is the altar method. Then he lists what the other practices demand. Selecting a pure site, smearing the ground, commissioning Buddha images, assembling offerings, everything from the last chapter, named and set aside. The ritual texts tell practitioners to keep that mirror in a bag on the body and take it out when it's time to recite. 400 years of ritual infrastructure, folded into something you carry. Then the third reason. Cundī practice, Daoshen writes, doesn't sort the pure from the impure. Lay or ordained. Drinking wine, eating meat, having a wife and children. All of them recite, where other spells require the precepts kept before practice is allowed at all. And the note he attaches is blunt. I'm paraphrasing, so take the sense of it rather than the wording. In effect, he argues, ordinary people have wives and children, and drinking and meat are simply their daily life. Monks teach them, and the habits don't change. If this method doesn't rescue such people, what day will they ever get out of birth and death? He adds a line most retellings drop, and it shouldn't be dropped. Anyone who does keep the fast and the precepts and practices this way gets a finer result still. He leaves the precepts standing. What he refuses is to put them in the doorway. One honest note on where the language comes from. The same formula circulates in later Cundī ritual texts under the Buddha's own voice, so Daoshen didn't invent the words. What he did was turn them into an argument and sign his name to it. Somebody took the walls down around this practice, and for once in this story, we know exactly who. So we have a portable rite and a monk with a written case for it. We should be able to follow that straight into the centuries after him. Hold on to that expectation. Because we can't. In a 2024 study, the historian Tianyu Lei challenges two common ways scholars have explained this history. One treats Juntei as a Chinese deity, borrowed from an Indian original. The other treats the cult as a continuous, gradual development down the centuries. Lei argues against both. His position is that Juntei is a goddess made in China, and that no evidence supports continuity in the cult from the Liao into Ming and Qing times. That takes something away from us. The answer we assembled 2 chapters ago is suddenly unavailable. Daoshen makes it portable, and then the road runs out. His book survives. It reaches Korea and gets printed there. A copy travels on to Japan, and material from Karakoto shows it circulating in the Tangut state. So the book can be traced. The living cult can't. Somewhere in that gap, we lose sight of the thing itself. And then, centuries later, she's everywhere again. Late Ming China. Lay associations organized around her recitation. Private chapels in serious numbers, tied to household and family religion. And the great monks of the period are right there in it. Hanshan, Zhuhong, and Zubao Zhenku, all involved in propagating her. Monastic promotion and household devotion are running in the same decades, feeding each other. A layman named Xie Yuzhou, who dies in 1635, compiles a full ritual program for her worship, with charts and detailed proceedings, running to real length. An ancient manuscript, then a mirror, then Daoshen's treatise, then a gap nobody can see across, and then a thick lay ritual manual with diagrams in it. She becomes associated with prayers for sons. In one regional drama, she grants a son to Mulian's mother. Did this practice survive, or did people build it again? And once rebuilding is on the table, every other Cundī has to be examined for what she was made out of. Japan first, where she went early and stayed. There she's Juntei. She lands inside a system called the 6 Kannon, 6 forms of Avalokiteshvara, each assigned to rescue beings from one of the 6 realms. The idea traces back to Zhiyi in 6th century China. The Japanese version is set out by Ono no Ningai, a Shingon prelate who dies in 1046. His list runs, Show cannon for the hells, the 1,000-armed for hungry ghosts, the horse-headed for animals, the 11-headed for the asuras, Juntei for human beings, Nyoirin for the gods. Cundī gets the humans, the realm with the most traffic. Then Tendai adopts the system and swaps her out, seating Fukukanjaku, the cannon of the never-empty lasso, in her chair. Same country, same 6 seats, 5 of the figures match. She's the one they argue about. And Sherry Fowler, who has done the work on these sets, finds that Ningai's list was never strictly kept anyway. Her seat never becomes stable across the Japanese groupings. Back to China and stranger. Sometime in the Ming, somebody writes the Fengshen Yan Yi, the Investiture of the Gods, a sprawling fantasy novel about a war among gods. In it, there's a figure called Jundi, her name. He's a master of what the novel calls the Western teaching, a fictional religious world shadowing Buddhism without being it. Scholars have traced Cundi's imagery sitting inside the character. A goddess of 70 million Buddhas turns up in a popular novel as a male immortal in an invented school. And she keeps going where nobody planned. There's a Cundī scripture that ends up preserved inside a Taoist collection instead of the Buddhist canon. There's a printed Jundi mantra sheet from the Republican era, now held at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, carrying Sino-Japanese religious exchange on a single piece of paper. Every one of these communities took what it needed and made something usable out of her. By this point, preserving Cundī and remaking Cundī have become impossible to separate. Line up the answers people have given. A distinct bodhisattva in her own right, a form of Avalokiteshvara, which is to say a form of Guanyin. Buddha Mater, Buddha Mother, one of the titles attached to her. Juntei Kannon in one Japanese school and a vacancy in another. Chunda in the Indian material, where the name shifts. A Chinese goddess who grants sons, a character in a novel. Guanyin deserves a moment, because that's the answer most people arrive with. The early Cundī scriptures don't introduce her as Guanyin. She shows up inside a textual world where Avalokiteshvara dominates, and over centuries the identification grows around her rather than being declared. Japan then makes it structural by seating Juntei among the forms of canon, where a viewer today would meet her already labeled. So, Cundī as Guanyin is an answer history produced. It isn't where the story starts. Here's where the history gets less tidy. The Indian record is real, and it isn't thin. Chunda appears in Indian tantric literature and in Indian iconography. Shantideva refers to her Dharani in the Shiksa Samukaya. Traditions connect her with the early Pala rulers of Bengal. What that record refuses to do is settle. The surviving forms vary so widely that many of them barely repeat. And Lay pushes harder still, holding that the Chinese goddess is a Chinese making rather than an import that arrived intact. That reading is recent, and it argues against the field's dominant models, so treat it as a live dispute and not a verdict. We came looking for the original Cundī, sitting underneath the Japanese version and the Ming version and the novelist's version, waiting at the bottom. The deeper you go looking for the original Cundī, the more versions you find. Go back to the mirror. For more than 1,000 years, people sat down in front of one and waited. A Tang practitioner inside a mandala of cow dung and perfumed water. A Liao practitioner with a new mirror standing in for the whole altar. Ming households, private chapels, prayers for sons. A printed sheet in the 20th century, folded and sold and eventually cataloged in Boston. Every era looked into that glass and saw something different arrive. None of them stopped reciting. The Dharani is what came through. It shifts across recensions. It circulates in a long form and a short one, and it gets transliterated differently everywhere it lands. It stays recognizable. That's the honest version, and it's enough. Almost everything around it turned out to be negotiable. Her category, her gender, in a novel, her seat in a Japanese lineup, the answer to whether she's Guanyin, which still depends on who you ask. So did the practice survive, or did people build it again? A tradition can come through by being carried. It can also drop out of sight completely and get assembled again later from whatever survived. Cundī makes it surprisingly hard to say where one of those ends and the other begins, which is also why we never got a single clean reason for why she kept resurfacing. There was never one continuous thing doing the resurfacing. There's a version of this outside religion, and you've probably watched it happen. A workshop closes. The last person who knew the craft dies without an apprentice, and the tools scatter. 30 years later, somebody takes one of the surviving objects apart on a bench, works out how it was made, and starts making them again. What they make is the craft. It's also not quite the craft. The people doing the work usually know both. What you hand on will not always survive the way you left it. Sometimes it survives only because someone later needed it enough to build it again. So here's what I want from you. Do you think a tradition is still the same tradition after people have had to rebuild it? Tell me in the comments where you draw that line, because I don't think there's an obvious answer. And if you want the figure Cundī keeps getting folded into, our video on Guanyin is the one to watch next. Stay curious. Stay wise.